I can't tell you how many times I've mispronounced a word because I've only encountered it in books, by the way. So cheers to books.
Yeah, to books, to only having to read.
Welcome to NeedleStack, the podcast for professional online research. I'm Aubrey Byron, NeedleStack producer, and your host for today.
And I'm Shannon Reagan, fellow NeedleStack producer, and I will be your armchair expert for today.
Do you have a good chair on your arm?
I actually have no arms for my chair, so
tragic.
Points deducted immediately.
We're taking over the podcast for 2 weeks to give our talent a little holiday time off and talk about one of our favorite subjects, books. As you can see behind me, perhaps.
Oh, yeah.
The next 2 episodes will be a special book club edition of the show. So follow along for fun research tips and maybe find your next great read.
I think I found my next great read. So yes, today is our book club. Today is my book club. Aubrey will be doing her book club next week. This is why we're drinking wine at 2 p.m, or not quite wine.
They don't know what time it is.
Don't tell them. My book club book is We Are Bellingcat. This organization, if you're not familiar, many of our viewers and listeners probably are, is the darling of the OSINT community. There have been lots of recommendations for this book on, the OSINT community at large. I have now succumbed. I'm piling on to those recommendations. It was fascinating. I was interested in Bellingcat for a long time, mostly through news articles, like really just seeing kind of the outcome of their research and the end finding. But I've been getting more into following researchers on Twitter, following Eliot Higgins, and really seeing, how the sausage is made, which this book gets into a lot of sausage making.
Awesome. So start us off. Who is Eliot Higgins and why did he write this book?
Yes. Eliot Higgins is the founder of Bellingcat and author of We Are Bellingcat. He is a college dropout. He was a stay-at-home dad for a time. So he really started doing these OSINT investigations, open source intelligence investigations, in his spare time while he was working as an admin, while he was unemployed, and everywhere in between. And eventually it became the Brown Moses blog. Was kind of the first iteration of pulling all this, data together into something formal. And then that eventually turned into the Bellingcat organization. I think what is really interesting about Higgins in this book is that he often, his detractors often try to pin the armchair expert insult to him. And he's like, yeah, I'm not really like an expert in anything but open source research. And that is the advantage, not the detraction. So, his curiosity and lack of expertise and love of open source is really, what fuels this stuff. So the book itself is how he turned that passion into the formation of Bellingcat.
That's an interesting point of view.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about Bellingcat and kind of the goal of that organization.
Yeah. So there's a part, I think it's like the last page, the end of the book of We Are Bellingcat is basically saying it's really hard to define who we are. There's a quote at the end of the book that is kind of a lack of definition, but this is it. It says, today Bellingcat finds itself in an unusual position. We are not exactly journalists, nor human rights activists, nor computer scientists, nor activists, nor academic researchers, nor criminal investigators, but are the nexus of all of these disciplines. So I think at a base level, you can call them an investigative journalist organization, but it really is all of these things and includes people from all of these practices to conduct the investigations. So it's very multifaceted and speaks to the changing and evolving nature of open source investigations. The motto of Bellingcat, for any of our listeners out there is a grand prize, is identify, verify, amplify. So they're, finding this information on open sources, verifying if it is true or not, and then when they find it to be true, to amplify that information. And they do that to support things like investigative journalism, which they themselves do. They have the site bellingcat.com, but also to support legal cases, academic study as well. And then I think the other big thing that the book gets at is just the effort to counteract the counterfactual community, is how Higgins identifies it, which obviously is, a huge problem in national discourse today around the world, certainly here in the US, this counterfactual community that kind of sneers at intelligence.
So, what is the counterfactual community?
So the counterfactual community, in this terms of sneers at intelligence, is, this belief that everything can be manipulated, and organizations like Bellingcat are manipulating, and they only exist to serve Western narratives. They believe that anything can be evidence. They claim to use, videos and images to back up their claims. They're doctoring theirs, so they just assume everyone else is doctoring theirs as well. Uh, it leads to this like endless questioning, question everything. They bring up Russia Today a lot in this book, whose motto is question everything. And that nothing can be trusted or verified, for that matter, which I think is what's so frustrating in OSINT, is that the work is not just finding stuff, but verifying if it's true or not. They believe that everything is corrupt, the game is rigged the world over, et cetera. But Higgins and Bellingcat, I think, are really pushing that this not be the dominant voice, because of the wealth of information is out there, because of the people that can be involved in the OSINT effort. It doesn't have to be the dominant voice. If it is, it's incredibly depressing and just wrong. So, we kind of have the power to do this, to overcome the skepticism. Here's how we do it, and here's how we used it in investigating, these cases that he looks at in the book.
So, what are some of the cases that they talk about in the book? Because they've been involved in some pretty interesting research in the past.
Yeah, to say the least. It goes back pretty far. It does go chronologically for the most part. It starts with the uprisings against Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad, and the subsequent conflicts that played out thereafter. It looks at the downing of the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in Ukraine, which is really how I started hearing about Bellingcat, through the news articles of that investigation. Goes into the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And another of the really in-depth ones is the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in London. Each of these is laid out, the investigation of them is laid out very in depth in the book, showing the tactics that they employed to, identify, verify, and amplify this information. So that is the fascinating part of the book, in addition to the story of how Bellingcat itself came out of these investigations.
Well, speaking of tactics, do they kind of walk you through what kind of tools or techniques they're using in the book?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the book, in addition to just the interest value. Each investigation kind of focuses on almost a different aspect. I would say, like the Libya one that comes up first, he's really just getting started and focusing on geolocating video footage. So this is pre-Bellingcat. This is just Eliot Higgins, in his bathrobe at his desk. It's very grassroots OSINT. So he lays out this one story that I found really interesting, and really just gets at the heart of what geolocating is. That he is watching a video of rebel forces claiming that they have taken over this town and riding around the town. The government is like, no, that's not true. We still hold this town. Don't trust this. This is not real. And so, based on lots of details around the video, one of the things that he does is map out all of the roads and intersections and landmarks that they're passing, in the background of this Joyride Conqueror video. And with that, he just, sketches it out on a piece of paper, and then goes to Google Earth, looks at the purported town, and starts trying to match, these intersections and landmarks. He scours what he's drawn versus Google Maps and the satellite imagery to see if it matches, the purported location. And it does. And I think, the tip that he really gives from this, you're seeing the logistics of how to do the geolocation, but he's also talking about how this process kind of takes out the messiness of three dimensions. That you're taking a video that there's a lot of emotion in, there's a lot of humanness in it, and trying to approach it from just the cold hard facts. So, he says he's not an Arabic speaker, so he can't understand what they're saying, but it almost helps in some sense because you're not distracted by the emotion of it. You're just looking at, does the satellite imagery match up? And in terms of that, just really pick one detail, one intersection, one landmark, something that has, a finiteness to it rather than trying to look for all things at once. You'll just kind of get lost in your search. So he's saying, be very specific in terms of what you're going to look for to match up between the video or image and the satellite imagery.
Yeah, the language barrier I know is a big thing for some of our listeners that we don't really talk about that much, but it's interesting for him to say that it can be helpful in a way.
Yeah, I think the takeaway is definitely don't let it be a barrier. And sometimes it can be an advantage. There's definitely a place for language expertise, but that's not every place. Like I said, this is a very bare bones geolocating case, but shows how much curiosity and open source tools play a part in it.
So, what kind of investigations do they get into in Syria?
Yeah, so Syria is next. I would say it might be the most graphic and violent. So, this book is definitely not for the faint of heart. They get into some really disturbing things, obviously. And like I said, being able to almost ignore these elements in the course of the investigation, not necessarily in the impetus for it, can be a gift not only to the quality of research, but also to the mental state of the researcher. He talks about taking care of yourself, for one, that you can be really affected by these things. So, try to compartmentalize, for lack of a better term, to improve the research itself and to kind of protect yourself in a certain way. In terms of like what type of research he focuses on in Syria, I think this is where he becomes an unsuspecting weapons expert because it's all he's doing. He's just looking at the weaponry over and over and over on like so many different videos and images. And his lack of expertise is, again, kind of good for this investigation because he's only using open sources. He's verifying it, with other information he's able to find online. And because of the nature of the conflict, traditional weapons expertise sometimes didn't apply. For the rebel groups, they were using a lot of DIY weaponry, IEDs, things like that they might look similar between different rebel groups, but in terms of traditional, military weaponry, that just wasn't what it was. Another aspect of the Syrian investigation is a big one in terms of, kind of geopolitical importance, that he looks at weaponry that was coming from, it was old like Yugoslav weaponry. It's like, why is this suddenly appearing? And they were able to find out in connection, I believe, with a New York Times investigation that the Saudis had bought weapons from Croatia that were from the former Yugoslavia and were smuggling them into Syria and distributing them to select, rebel groups that they wanted to back. So that was fascinating. The other one, like I said, is pretty dark, is the use of indiscriminate weapons by the Assad forces. So barrel bombs, cluster bombs, and the chemical weapons attacks, and how they attributed them to the Assad forces and not the rebel forces is really at the crux of that. And doing it all through social media and video footage. There was one video that really kind of cracked this case wide open. And it's a video of Assad forces in a military aircraft surrounded by barrel bombs and lighting a fuse of one with a cigarette and kicking it out the back of a plane onto a town that had said we were the victim of barrel bombs, and the Assad forces denied it. And, not only are you seeing it play out, the reason that they were able to verify it is because the cameraman at the end looks out over the back of the open aircraft and essentially gets, an aerial view of this city that the bomb is now falling on. So, things like that
Wow.
it's a very, very much a smoking gun, but would not have been there, were it not for people looking at open source footage from this perspective.
You mentioned investigation with the New York Times. I'm curious, what is their relationship like with traditional media or traditional journalism? Do they mention that?
Definitely. They're there to be collaborators. That I think, there are some parts where he comes off as critical of journalism for, I think, historically ignoring open source information, and a lot of the intelligence or investigative bodies that were around before OSINT really took off, like 10 years or so ago. I think it is still kind of a dirty word in those agencies and newsrooms that are used to relying kind of on their traditional means and just tend to ignore open sources. Um, Higgins, I think, essentially says that that's a form of neglect now. You don't necessarily need to become an OSINT expert yourself, but you need to be able to partner with these people and understand the intelligence products that they are releasing and include them, use them as corroboration for the other sources that you're relying on.
Were there other investigations in the book that stood out to you?
Yes. I think some of the most interesting ones were not just investigating, verifying a piece of footage or whatever, but performing some means of attribution of who's responsible for this, how high up does it go, that sort of thing. So there were two ones that were really in depth. There was the one on tracking the Buck Buke. I'm probably saying this wrong. I'm not a weapons expert. I've only read this word. The missile launcher that took down the Malaysian Airlines flight, and saying that not only did it come down by a missile, but that it came down from this one that was in rebel held territory and that came from Russia, and Russia, its military command must have known that this was going on. So that one is really painstaking, tracking the launcher, coming from Russia, moving into the rebel held territory, moving back out one missile shy, back into Russia, and, all of the logistics of, who had to okay that in order for it to happen. So that one was really fascinating. Lots of, image verification, video verification of open sources included in that. The other one that involves attribution is the Skripal poisoning, the Novichok poisoning in London. Again, an amazing case study in attribution. So identifying who the individuals were, their military links, and then basically who in the chain of command again had to okay this. And doing it, this was the one that was a lot of open sources, but they essentially ran into a brick wall, and they did accept closed sources into this investigation. And he talks a lot about the kind of ethical standards of doing that, and why they chose to do it in this case and why they don't generally choose to do it in others. The other one hit very close to home in terms of the US. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was interesting to see, again, kind of an ethics consideration of who they chose to investigate and identify, and who they chose to ignore at this rally as well.
I can't tell you how many times I've mispronounced a word because I've only encountered it in books, by the way. So cheers to books.
Yeah, to books, to only having to read.
How did they determine, though, in the Unite the Right rally, who was investigated and who was ignored?
Yeah. So they focus not on the entire rally, they focus on a specific video of an altercation, to put it lightly, of a group of white men beating a black man, I think in a parking structure, a parking lot. So they do identify them, but everyone else at the rally technically still covered under First Amendment rights. And there's this sense of not wanting to release the hounds. I know, like in the Boston bombing, there was the misidentification. They talk about this in the book of who the suspects were and what that led to. And so they're very careful in terms of what they choose to investigate and then the information that they choose to amplify and kind of release to the broader community.
Yeah, I remember the Boston bombing, and that actually kind of leads me to a question is I'm curious kind of what their ethical standards are, especially both considering themselves journalists and or because, your identifications, especially if incorrect, can have pretty drastic effects on people.
Yeah. So I think the importance of establishing an organization like Bellingcat is to put some parameters and some ethics around open source, which is kind of the Wild West, for lack of a better term. Anybody can do it. Anybody can access the information. That is the beauty and the danger of it. So for Bellingcat, they choose to only investigate items that have significance in terms of political or like political power or global conflict, or themselves are crimes under local jurisdictions or things like war crimes. I think another ethic is transparency. That whatever they lay out, they need to make sure that anybody can go kind of follow that paper trail and come to the same conclusions that they can. And that there is a duty to preserve that paper trail. There is a thing that Higgins keeps coming back to. You can tell it really affects him personally, that at a conference, he's speaking and a Syrian activist stands up and says, people are risking their lives to collect this footage and this evidence, and pretty much nothing is being done with it in terms of prosecutions or military efforts. Why should we risk our lives to do this? And that comes back to Higgins' duty to preserve. So they themselves are serving as a receptacle, to preserve this information lest it disappear. And that can disappear because the services that they're uploaded to go out of service. This was the case in a very popular video upload site for Syrian activists that just shut down, and all of that was lost. In terms of platforms that are still up and running, they can choose to delete your content because of violations of terms of service, things like that. They're also preserving, not just for future prosecutions, but also if we're still not able to prosecute, but there's this possibility of revisionist history, that authoritarians decide we're just going to pretend like this never happened, get rid of it, erase the history of it. And so he takes archiving, I think itself as an ethical requirement to archive and to maintain chain of custody. That you don't want this evidence thrown out if it does get to a court of law because it was sloppily handled, it could have been manipulated, and it's all for naught because you didn't follow chain of custody rules.
Yeah, the archivist part is something I didn't realize they were doing, and seems important.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bellingcat is doing it to an extent, like for specific investigations, but he talks about different organizations. Like there's one for the Syrian conflict that is literally making an archive of all of this information and trying to catalog it in a way that's easily searchable for this future use.
So in the spirit of anybody can do this at home, and or what might be relevant to our audience of professional researchers, do they talk about the tools or resources they use? And is there anything you think our audience might want to know about?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are pretty obvious. I think the award for like most cited tool is Google Earth. It's just amazing to think like before Google Earth, like a lot of this research just would not be possible. So thank you, Google Earth. Thank you, Google. Something we don't say often to the overlords. Another one that was more obscure and very specific, but very useful to geolocation is SunCalc. So this is a site that, or a tool that helps you understand the time of day that some piece of video or image was taken based on the shadows. So it helps in verifying the legitimacy of the context around the posting of information, or if you're doing something chronological like the missile launcher investigation of, it's like, okay, the missile was here at this time, it was here at this time, it was here at this time, it was here at this time. SunCalc was something I'd never heard of before. The other one, getting after chain of custody, is Hunchly. I think we've recommended this on the show before. It tracks the investigators, all of their clicks and views, preserves all the pages that you visit to retain that entire process, and preserve it for future investigations if somebody else picks it up. So Hunchly is the other one. And then I mentioned also, if you're investigating in terms of a particular conflict, there may already be archival databases that are open source that you can access for cataloged and easily searchable information. And of course, then there is Bellingcat themselves, that they offer training on all these types of, OSINT tactics. They have an online investigation toolkit. Both of these are available on their site. I believe they're free for anyone to use, so go check them out. There's tons of different trainings and workshops that they do that should be very helpful.
So, last question: how many stars out of 5 would you
Oh
rate
my
it?
goodness. I would give it, for an OSINT book, I would give it 5 stars. It's chock full of
Wow.
it's chock full of information. It is the OSINT world, up, down, in, out. And because they have the investigative journalism background, or his ghostwriter does at least, it's really well written. Like, it's a pretty short book, but it's very dense. But to be able to tell those stories in an interesting way that you don't feel bogged down, it was a good read. So 5 stars.
Awesome. I can't wait to pick it up. Hopefully, our audience will too.
Yeah,
Well, you heard it here. Thanks for telling us about your OSINT read, Shannon.
loved
And
it.
if you liked what you heard, you can subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts, watch episodes on YouTube, and view transcripts and other episode info on our website, authentic8.com/needlestack. And that's authentic with the number 8.com/needlestack. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and tell us what you thought of the show at NeedleStack Pod. And we will be back next week with another OSINT book club with me in the hot seat having to explain it to you and Shannon as the host. We'll see you then.
Bye.